Art Therapy, Deconstructing the Practice, with Glenda Needs.
So today I'd like to talk about the Arts Therapy Continuum. It's often difficult to decide where art for well-being and one's own personal exploration actually falls over potentially into becoming an art therapy process. And I think it's important for us to articulate what is art therapy and what is not via something like a continuum so that we can understand where it is that we are practicing at any given point. So if we think about art generally, we know that when we are engaged in art making, perhaps in our own home, in our own studio, that actually that opportunity to paint, perhaps draw, express ourselves, or maybe through dance or movement or singing, that actually has an innate function of either calming or soothing us or giving us an opportunity to step away from our normal day-to-day activity, and that this is so often therapeutic. So there's no question that the arts themselves have a therapeutic quality about them. And that really in the pursuit of well-being, I would hope that everyone would have access to expressing themselves through the arts. Somewhere along the line though, we enter into a field of art making and art exploration or creativity that requires the skills of a therapist. If in fact we didn't, there would be no need for art therapists. So in order to have this field of art therapists, we need to recognise that there is a need for some people to have a facilitator or a support person to create that. And it's where that line is cut or where that line splits that is often a difficult notion for people. So let's imagine this as a continuum that runs from the incidental value of engaging in the art. That is, the therapy occurs incidentally. That is not without any intent for it to be therapeutic, but that simply engaging in the arts means that there is some therapeutic value. And let's look at the other end of that continuum as being the directed end. That is where art or creativity is directed towards a therapeutic goal, and that the arts are used in a way that very clearly points to achieving some outcome for the client. So if we look at that, we can consider that at the incidental end is one's own personal exploration of art and personal opportunities for engaging creatively. We might also see that when people come together in a group, perhaps at their local community centre, and engage in art making, that it adds a little bit more therapeutic value. It may be that not only are they having the opportunity to express themselves creatively, but they also have an audience or a witness for that they have others they can work alongside, and that it develops a sort of hive mentality when you are working together with people creatively. It may be that if we step even further along that continuum, that we start to see that groups that are run specifically for perhaps marginalised populations, you might have adolescents who have disengaged from school, you might have refugee populations that art therapists might work with or artists might work with for the benefit of engaging in art and in the presence of others, so that there is, again, group support. This may help foster communication, friendships, a sense of accomplishment when one is creating, and it may give opportunity for informal sharing through their artistic expressions. Let's jump a little bit further down that line, and what we might see is that there is a counsellor, for instance, who is giving a client the opportunity to show what's happening for them through the art. It may be a school counsellor who's working with children, who's using art to help them work through trauma, maybe working through experiences from the schoolyard. And so the art is being used then in quite a much more directed way. We still wouldn't call that art therapy because the modality is still top-down. It is still dealing from a verbal perspective in a verbal counselling model and then working down into the visual system and creating those images as a almost secondary part of that process. Moving further along, we'll find that there are people who use art in assessment. So there are certain assessment tools around, and there are therapists who will look at things like brain degeneration through the art making. It's possible, for instance, to look at Lewy body's dementia through the use of art to actually determine how progressed they might be in their disease. So again, this is using art in a very direct way towards either assessing or achieving a therapeutic outcome. Still, it is a top-down process. A little bit further along, though, we might discover that there are art therapists who are asking the clients to create the art first, and that the art comes as the key tool for awareness rather than the language. And so art is created, and then from processing, reflecting on that, thinking carefully about what's presented on the page and having the therapist guide some questioning and some exploration, the art can then actually create the new way of knowing. So again, in this instance, it is a bottom-up processing. The visual system, the sensory system is impacted first by creating the art first, and then it is moved into that more logical, cognitive awareness of how things might change. And finally, if we move even further along that continuum, you may have an art therapist or an art psychotherapist who is working very specifically with a particular diagnosis with particular clients. For instance, you may have a therapist who is working with a client who has dissociative identity disorder, and the art psychotherapist is very clearly utilising the art in specific ways and through specific processes to assist the client to reintegrate and to bring those disparate parts of themselves together. Again, in this instance, it would be a bottom-up process, very directed towards a therapeutic goal, and clearly not the same sort of art for well-being that you would be doing right down at the incidental end of that scale. So we, of course, have things like arts in health programs. We have, well-being programs run for kids in schools. We have all sorts of programs that use art. And at this point, I hope that this will be able to help you to define where along that continuum it might fall, and also to be able to see where art moves from being innately therapeutic and where the benefits are simply from engaging, through to a point where you can put a line on that continuum and say from here on is really where you need the additional skills and knowledge of a therapist. That is someone who understands things like vicarious trauma, who understands things like resistance and cognitive behavioural therapy, for instance, or other models that actually can also fit very nicely alongside art therapy. So we certainly get to talk about this a lot more as we go through our series. We can be looking more specifically at particular areas. And of course, an art therapist can work down at that incidental end of the spectrum, as long as they're careful about how they label what it is that they're doing. It may be that the art therapist is running an art program, which is absolutely wonderful, but be careful about calling it art therapy. One of the challenges with this is that the general public become very confused about what is art therapy and what is not. If people are labelling something as art therapy when in fact it could be done by somebody with no training and looks no different. So it's not to say that an art therapist can't do those programs, but we just need to be careful about that labelling and be sure when we're labelling it art therapy that we are indeed working down that other end of the spectrum where we are very specifically using art to achieve therapeutic outcome. Thanks for joining us today. If you like what you've seen, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you'd like to inquire about clinical supervision, please click on the link in the description box below. Thank you.